Hi guys, Marcus here, Everything Tenere, and welcome to part 2 in the suspension deep dive series. Today is all about suspension aftermarket parts and accessories, what you can upgrade, other small bits and bobs that you can put on your bike to improve your suspension. So that's what we're going to cover today. But before we start, we need to categorize the different type of riders. So I put them in 4 different rider categories, and I will show them up here, and they're a bit funny, but at the same time very explanatory, and in which category you fall into, and I put a list on what type of upgrades for the different categories are maybe needed, or what you can choose from. All the different aftermarket suspension upgrades and accessories. So let's check out that rider matrix that I created. I will put them up here on the wall, and yeah, let's start off with number 1, and that's what I call the Starbucks racer. So a Starbucks racer is someone that only rides tarmac, maybe commutes with his bike, go into the city and whatnot, but nothing really on gravel or on trails or anything like that. Number 2, that's the weekend adventurer. So the weekend adventurer is someone that takes his bike for some small adventures on the weekend, and mostly go on tarmac and some light gravel roads, and that's it. Number 3, the adventure nut. So the adventure nut goes on long adventures, many miles on tarmac, on gravel roads, and some light trails or off-road. But number 4, the nutcase. And I'm the nutcase. And I'm sure there are many nutcases out there doing exactly what I do. And that is taking the Tenere 700 on places where you maybe should not take the T7 on, where the 300 TPIs rule the earth, right? So a lot of adventures, of course, but heavy off-road, taking it to places where it's really hard to get up, or to technical trails and whatnot, that requires a lot of maybe skills, which I'm lacking of. But yeah, going hardcore off-road with a 204 kilogram bike, and that's the nutcase. So now we pretty much settled the different rider types in my rider matrix, so to call, and the actions for aftermarket upgrades are different from my point of view, depending on which type of rider you are. So now I just categorize them, so it's a bit easier for me to name accessories, aftermarket parts, and upgrades that might be necessary. So if we start with the Starbucks racer. So we have the Starbucks racer up here, and as you can see, I don't see a need for any upgrades. Maybe if you're a really heavy rider, then maybe a rear spring could be a good thing to do, but not necessarily playing around with the front much. Just change your settings, add compression and add rebound. That's it. No need to waste a lot of money on improving a bike that is only going on tarmac. The adventure nut. So we have the adventure nut up here, and when it comes to the adventure nut, depending on what you do, I highly advise that you change your rear spring, maybe do a front spring replacement as well, and I think that's pretty much enough. But if you do a lot of different rides with different load down on the bike, it might be easier if you maybe add preload spaces in the front if needed, and do not do a spring replacement. You could also get the Rally Raid caps, adjustable caps, where you have adjustable preload. It's a lot of different things you can do, but necessarily you do not need to put a lot of cash down on upgrades. If you just ride tarmac and gravel roads, you don't need to do much, but for sure it could be really nice with some correct spring rates in the front and rear. So now we have the adventure nut, and if you're an adventure nut, you do a lot of miles. You want comfort, you want performance in suspension, and you want it to be able to take, you know, harder gravel roads, some light off-road, and so on. So for sure you would need to respring your rear, your front, maybe do a valve kit or a piston kit. K-Tech has one, and I will show you all the different options you have. Maybe you want preload caps or the adjustable caps on your front fork. But also replacing the cartridge and the rear shock is an option. It's a bit more expensive, but it could be worth it, right? So that's the options you have for the three first riders. And now we get to the crazy guys, right? So the nut case, well, here you need to go all in pretty much. If you really ride hard on your T7, you will need to at least replace the front cartridge and also the rear shock. And then you have a multitude of options in a lot of different price ranges. But if you go really hardcore, well, you maybe want to have a 48mm front fork, and you have pretty much only two options right now, and I will show you them as well. And of course, a rear shock. Other than that, you know, it's a lot of money to put on your bike, but hopefully it's well worth it if you ride hard. So let's go and check all the different aftermarket parts that are available for suspension, and that's from, you know, small upgrades to springs and whatnot. And I will show you pictures here and names of what they're called. And mainly when I checked out all the different options, I have checked Rally Raid's website. So we have Rally Raid up here. It has been offtheroad.de, so the German reseller, which have a lot of different aftermarket parts. So we have them here as well. And Touratech, I checked them, so they are here too. And K-Tech as well. And then also checked a few other sites for more information, like Buono Racing in Italy, and a few more other places. But I will write everything down in the subjects with all the links and so on. Otherwise I will have links up here, or is it there? I never remember, for the different parts, so you can check out the websites and so on. So let's start with the cheap stuff and the small improvements and the small accessories for your suspension. First off, of course, springs. And you have a multitude of springs here, everything from Hyper Pro spring sets, liner springs, progressive springs, front and rear sets, and you have just rear springs, all the different weight categories that you need depending on your weight as a rider with luggage and so on, for both front and rear. You also have K-Tech here with a valve kit, or a piston kit as they call it, so you replace the valving and the shims in your OEM cartridge with an improved shim stack. So adjustments will be more noticeable and a lot better. So you can purchase the front fork piston kits, and you could probably install them yourself, but otherwise you go to a suspension specialist. For the rear shock, you would need to hand in your rear shock as a suspension specialist who can customize the shim stack in your shock or rear shock. Then we have other accessories from Rally Raid. For example, we have these preload washers or preload spacers that you can add in your front fork on top of the springs, so in between the springs and the spring seat or the washer that you have in your cartridge here. So these you can add more spacers to achieve the correct sag if you're not replacing the OEM springs. So depending on your weight, you might get off with just putting some preload spacers in. And that was the first thing I did in my shock to improve everything. I added some preload spacers in. Rally Raid also have these spring guides with an improved hydraulic end stop. So you can buy new spring guides if you crack your spring guides that you have in your OEM shock. However, on the side note here, they do not fit with the OEM springs. You need to have aftermarket springs with at least 26 millimeters of inner diameter. But of course, if you change your springs in the front, you might as well maybe order the improved spring guides, because the hydraulic end stop is tighter and much more improved, so you will not go through the travel of the fork and have a really hard stop to it. Then of course we have a lot of more different things. There are the preload caps or the adjustable caps. Rally Raid have them, and they're another brand as well available at offtheroad.de. And that's a good thing if you replace your springs, but you will want to have adjustability in preload. And then you can add these, and they're a bit pricey, but might be worth your money. What do we have more? Well, now we covered springs, preload caps, spring guides, preload spacers. Next thing where you get up in price, it's the cartridges. So you replace the front cartridge. And the price range here varies a lot. So Adriani has some really good priced cartridges, everything from 450 euros up to 700 something euros. The only downside I see with these is they have the same diameter as the OEM cartridge, so 20 millimeter. So you're a bit limited there on the shim stack in the cartridge itself. Of course it will be an improvement from the OEM cartridge, but you can see the different cartridges they have here, and there are more available with different travel as well. So you have minus 35 millimeter, I think, and you also have plus 30 millimeter and the standard travel of the shock. So you decide what you want to have. Remember that if you replace the cartridge up in front with one with more travel, you need to raise the rear up as well, so you keep the geometry of the bike in the correct stance, so to say, because the rake will be different in the front if it's lower in the back and so on. And if you don't want to go the route with replacing the rear shock with a plus 30 millimeter rear shock, there are dog bones for raising up the rear, just as you have availability of replacing dog bones, so you lower the bike, right? And same goes for all the different cartridges pretty much. Some of the cartridges you can get the lowered cartridge version, the standard, or the added travel, and it's usually 25 to 30 millimeters added travel in the front. In the rear it's, I think mostly 30 millimeters added travel. Some rear shocks that has a preload adjuster, which is with a knob, you maybe only get 25 millimeter of added travel. Depends on the brand. Other than cartridges, you have complete front ends as well. And I only found two complete front ends when you move from the standard 43 millimeter fork up to 48. Like KTM has 48 millimeter front forks, we do not on the T7. So Öhlins has a complete front with a 48mm fork, but the travel is only 226mm. So it's not a huge difference from the stock one. And you could get a cartridge with plus 30mm travel, and you have more travel than the 48mm front fork. However, you have a much stiffer fork, and you have much better oil flow. It's also a closed cartridge, and I will talk about that as well. So there are, of course, adjustability improvement. One of the cartridges will be a compression cartridge, and the other one will be a rebound cartridge. And almost all the cartridge kits you can buy have separated the compression and rebound. So you have one compression and one rebound. So only adjusting the cartridges from the top cap, and also, of course, added preload adjuster in the top as well. The other 48mm front fork set that you can buy is from Boano Racing, and their kit is a bit more extreme. It comes with a front fender, all the different brake hoses and so on, and it gives you 290mm of front fork travel, and that's a lot. And I'm not sure how they really made that, because they haven't raised the bike a lot, only by, I think it was 0.5 or 5mm they raised the bike. But you still need to get another dog bone for that kit, so you raise up the rear, so you get an even geometry. So you've seen the pictures here, which I put up on the wall, and now let's move over to the rear shocks. So the rear shocks, it's the same as I said before. You have a lot of different rear shocks. Rear shocks are often more pricey than front cartridges. It's also a pretty advanced unit. Most of them have low and high speed compression settings. So what I mean with that is that you have two different adjusters for the compression. One is low speed, and low speed is for when you compress the rear slowly. So just going over small uneven things on the ground, which doesn't really put a lot of quick force to the shock. And high speed is for those really high speed compressions where you hit some rocks, or going over a log or whatever. That's high speed compression. You can adjust those separately, and that's really good. Then of course they have rebound adjuster and a separate preload adjuster, which you mount outside from the shock, or you have a cam on the shock itself where you manually adjust the preload. Those shocks are a bit cheaper than the one with an external preload adjuster. So you have to choose your route, how much money you have to spend. But a cam on the shock itself, it's not that hard to adjust. It's a bit more fiddly because you need to reach in there and you need to turn it to adjust your sag. So we talked about open cartridges, and Rally Raid have an open cartridge. I think that Touratech also have an open cartridge. Otherwise, all the different cartridges that you buy are closed cartridges. I think Adriani has a few open cartridges as well, but the difference between an open cartridge and closed cartridge, I will explain that. So an open cartridge is very easy to make maintenance on. You can do it yourself. The leg is full with oil to a certain amount, and the oil is pretty much free flowing in the piston, outside the cartridge, and so on. And that's how it works. A closed cartridge has a closed cartridge. So the internal of the front in the leg is closed off. It has a gas-filled bladder in the cartridge itself, so it always keeps the same pressure on the oil in the cartridge. You have no air in the cartridge itself, so it's much more difficult to maintain yourself. if you would need to replace something in the cartridge itself, you would need to go to a suspension specialist, because they need to open it up. You will lose all the air or the gas inside, and when they refill it, they suck all the air out and then refill it with oil and also add gas to the bladder. But you have better performance out of a closed cartridge. So you have less foaming or cavitation of the oil, and that's where you work the shock or the cartridge really hard. You can get some microscopic air bubbles in the oil, and that will make the performance of the compression and rebound less. So it will not work as good, because the oil will heat up as well, and then you will get more cavitation of the oil. All the rear shocks are closed cartridges or closed shocks. So those you have to hand in at the suspension specialist to maintain, or if you need to replace the oil or oil seals. The front one, of course, you can always replace the oil seal and the dust cap. That's no problem. And you have some oil outside of the cartridge itself on closed cartridges, but that's only to lubricate the chrome leg and the golden tube of your fork. So the movement there is smooth, so to say. So you have just a small amount of oil between the cartridge and the tube. So one thing else about the cartridges and rear shocks, if you search the web, you find different brands like Rally-Raid, Touratech. I think there is another brand for rear shocks as well, I don't remember the name, but then you also have Tractive. All these three ones are built out of Tractive, so they are similar, but Rally-Raid is pretty much the only one that has an open cartridge from Tractive. All the other ones are the same, they are priced pretty much the same, they work the same, they have the same specs and whatnot. So it's different brands made by Tractive. So Touratech and Rally-Raid are Tractive cartridges and rear shocks. And they're of course customized for example Rally-Raid. They maybe have a different shimming or some other specs that is slightly different, but otherwise it's the same kind of cartridges. And you search the web, check Rally-Raid, check Off the Road and the different resellers for cartridge kits and so on, and try to find the best deal. But I advise, if you're gonna buy a cartridge, go with a bit more expensive cartridge with a bigger diameter of the cartridge itself. So Tractive ones are 35mm, so you will find that on Touratech and Rally-Raid. I do not have any experience with Adriani, but I'm sure they're much better than the OEM cartridge. So if you're short on cash, maybe Adriani is the way to go. And of course, you do not need to replace the rear shock if you replace the cartridge. If you go up in travel, maybe then you maybe should replace the rear shock as well, or get a shorter dog bone for the linkage in the rear to raise the bike up. But otherwise, have fun out there, try out stuff, and don't go too wild spending cash on suspension upgrades. But do your research thoroughly and try to find the best one for you. And if you have any questions or anything, don't hesitate to comment below or send me an email at everythingtenere@hotmail.com, or visit my social media as Instagram. It's everything_Tenere. And of course, I'm available at tenere700.net. And you can instant message me on Instagram otherwise, if you have any questions or in doubt of something. So I hope you enjoy this little deep dive in the different aftermarket parts we have for the suspension on the T7, that it has helped you maybe do more research or come with a final decision on what to get. I know it's hard and it's a lot of money, but follow my little matrix, see where you are in the matrix, what kind of rider you are, what kind of upgrades you might go for, and so on. So hope you liked it. Like and subscribe, and stay safe, take care, and don't do anything stupid. Cheerios, bye bye.